There is a shop in an ancient city where cloth goes in one color and comes out another. You would not know it by looking at the outside. Just a low doorway, a stone floor stained 100 different shades from 100 years of work, and a large clay vat sitting in the corner, filled almost to the brim. The dye maker takes a length of plain white cloth. He does not sprinkle it. He does not dip a corner in and pull it back out. He plunges the entire thing under, all at once, and holds it there. Watch the color change in your mind. Not on the surface, all the way through. When that cloth comes back up, it is not decorated. It is not improved. It is different. You could not turn it back into the cloth it used to be if you tried. The old fibers are still there, but the old color is gone forever. The Greek word for what that dye maker is doing is baptizo, to plunge, to immerse, to submerge something completely until it comes out changed all the way through. Stay with that image, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand why the early church picked that exact word, a dye maker's word, to describe the most important moment in a believer's life. And once you see it, you will never look at a baptism the same way again. This is not a story about a church ceremony. This is not a story about a font of water at the front of a sanctuary. This is not a story about something people do on a Sunday morning because a pastor told them to. This is a story about the oldest rescue symbol in human history, one that God started writing thousands of years before anyone was ever baptized in a church building at all. You have probably seen a baptism. Maybe you have been baptized yourself. Someone said some words, you went under water or had it poured over your head, and everyone clapped. But here's what most people miss. That moment did not begin with the church. It did not even begin with John the Baptizer standing in the Jordan River. It began further back than that, much further back. It began with a boat, a flood, and a man named Noah who spent decades building something nobody believed he would ever need. Genesis, chapter 6. The world has gone wrong in a way that is hard to even picture. Violence everywhere. Every thought of every heart bent toward evil, all the time. And in the middle of that ruined world, there is one man who still walks with God. His name is Noah. God tells Noah to build a boat. Not a small boat. A massive one, the size of a small stadium, made of gopher wood, sealed inside and out with pitch. And Noah starts building it on dry land, nowhere near an ocean, while his neighbors watch and laugh. You can imagine what that must have felt like. Years of hammering, years of people walking by, shaking their heads, telling him he'd wasted his life on a boat that would never touch water. The Hebrew word for what came next is mabul. It is used nowhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible except this one event. Not for a heavy rainstorm, not for a flooded river, only for this, a flood that ends one world and begins another. And when the water finally comes, it does two things at the exact same time. It destroys everything corrupt on the face of the earth, and it lifts Noah's boat safely above all of it. The same water, judgment for the world outside the boat, rescue for the family inside it. That's the pattern. Hold on to it, because it is about to repeat. Move forward now hundreds of years. A former slave nation called Israel is trapped between the sea and an army. Pharaoh's chariots are closing in behind them. The Red Sea is in front of them. There is nowhere left to run. And then the sea splits. Israel walks through on dry ground, with walls of water standing on either side of them like something out of a nightmare turned inside out. And when Pharaoh's army tries to follow, the water that had been held back comes crashing down. Same pattern. The water that judges the old life is the very same water that delivers the new one. Israel doesn't just escape Egypt that day. They walk through death and come out the other side as a free people. A nation is born in that water. But it gets stranger, because not every water story in the Bible is about the whole world or an entire nation. Some of them are about one person, one broken body, one proud man who has to be humbled before he can be healed. His name is Naaman, and he is not an Israelite at all. He's a Syrian, a commander of armies, a man used to being obeyed. And he has leprosy, a disease that, in his world, means a slow death sentence wrapped in shame. A servant girl, taken captive from Israel, tells Naaman's wife about a prophet back in her homeland who could heal him. So Naaman travels there, expecting something worthy of his rank, ceremony, spectacle, a prophet waving his hand over the wound and calling down fire from heaven. Instead, the prophet Elisha doesn't even come to the door. He sends a servant with a message. Go and dip 7 times in the Jordan River, and you'll be clean. Naaman is furious. The Jordan is a muddy, unremarkable river. He has better rivers back home. He almost leaves in his pride, ready to go home diseased rather than obey something so small, so undignified, so beneath him. But his own servants talk him down. And Naaman goes to the river. He dips once. Nothing. Twice. Nothing. By the 6th time, you can imagine what he must have been thinking. That this was foolishness, that he'd been humiliated for nothing. Then he dips a 7th time. And Naaman comes up out of that water with skin like a child's. Clean. Healed. Undone by the very obedience he almost refused to give. Here's what most people miss about these 3 stories. A flood, a sea, a river, a family, a nation, a single desperate man. Different scale, different centuries, different characters entirely, but the exact same pattern over and over again. Water that separates who you used to be from who you are about to become. Flood, sea, river. 3 different centuries. 3 completely different kinds of people. And every single time, water is doing the same job, closing a door on an old life and opening one on a new life that couldn't exist without going through it first. If you're seeing that pattern now, you're seeing exactly what the earliest Christians saw when they read their own scriptures. This isn't a coincidence God buried by accident. It's a pattern he was writing on purpose, thousands of years before it showed up in a river outside Jerusalem with a wild-looking prophet standing in it. If this is opening your eyes to something in the text you'd read 100 times and never noticed, hit subscribe before we go further, because it's about to get even more specific than a flood or a sea. It's about to show up in one man, in one river, on one ordinary afternoon that changed everything. Out in the wilderness near the Jordan River, a man shows up who looks like he stepped out of the pages of the old prophets. Camel hair cloak, a leather belt, locusts and wild honey for food. His name is John, and crowds are traveling from Jerusalem and all across Judea just to hear him. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing decades later and with no interest in defending Christianity, still records that John's preaching drew massive crowds to the Jordan. Confirmation, from outside the Bible entirely, that this wasn't some small local movement. Something real was happening at that river, and you can trace it in more than one ancient source. John is calling people to turn away from the lives they'd been living and be immersed in the Jordan as a sign of it. Not a symbolic sprinkle. A full plunge under that water, the same water Naaman once stood in, the same river Israel's ancestors crossed generations earlier. And this is where it gets remarkable. One day, a man walks down to the water to be baptized by John. His name is Jesus of Nazareth, and John immediately tries to stop him. You can hear the confusion in John's own words. Jesus doesn't need this. Jesus has no old life to leave behind, no sin to wash away, nothing to be cleansed of. If anything, John says, it should be the other way around. Jesus should be baptizing him. But Jesus insists. He steps into the water anyway, not because he needs rescuing, because he is choosing completely and on purpose to stand exactly where sinful, broken, desperate humanity stands. He goes under the same water as the addict and the liar and the proud commander and the frightened family in the boat. He identifies with all of it. All of us. All of you. And when he comes up out of that water, something happens that had not happened since the very beginning of everything. The Hebrew word ruach, the spirit, the breath of God, is the same word used in Genesis chapter 1, hovering over the waters before the world had light or shape or life in it. And now, over the Jordan, that same spirit descends again, like a dove resting on Jesus. And a voice from heaven says the words every human being longs, somewhere deep down, to hear said over them. This is my beloved. In him, I am well pleased. Pay attention to this. The very first act of Jesus' public life is stepping into water meant for sinners. Before a single sermon, before a single miracle, before the cross, he starts by standing exactly where you stand. That is not an accident. That is the whole story compressed into one afternoon at a river. Now we come to the highest stakes of anything you've heard so far. Not a flood that ends a world. Not an army chasing a nation into the sea. Not even a disease eating away at a proud man's body. This time, the stakes are a single human soul, standing at the edge of taking his own life, in the middle of the night, in chains. His name is unknown to history except by his job. He's a jailer in the Roman city of Philippi. And on this particular night, two prisoners in his custody, a man named Paul and his companion Silas, are singing hymns at midnight, beaten and bleeding from a public flogging, locked in the deepest cell with their feet in stocks. Then the earth shakes. Not a small tremor. A violent earthquake that snaps every chain loose and throws every prison door wide open. The jailer wakes to find the doors standing open. And in that instant, he assumes the worst. Every prisoner has escaped, and Roman law says he will pay for that with his own life. He draws his sword. He is about to end it himself, right there, rather than face the shame and the execution waiting for him. And then, out of the darkness, Paul's voice. Don't harm yourself. We are all still here. The jailer calls for a torch. He rushes in, trembling, and falls down in front of Paul and Silas. And then he asks the question that every human heart has asked in some form, in some language, in some midnight moment of its own. What must I do to be saved? Here's the part nobody tells you about what happens next. Paul doesn't hand him a scroll to study, doesn't schedule a meeting for next week. That very hour, in the middle of the night, the jailer and his entire household are taken to be baptized, immersed, all of them, before the sun even comes up. Think about the timing. This man was seconds from death by his own hand. And within the same hour, he is underwater and coming back up a completely different man, in a completely different story than the one he thought he was living an hour before. Remember the die maker, back at the start of all this. Remember baptizo, to plunge something under until it comes out changed all the way through, not sprinkled, not decorated, not touched up at the edges. That is exactly what the Apostle Paul, the same man standing in that Philippian jail, writes about years later in his letter to the church in Rome. He says that when a person is baptized, they are buried with Christ, fully under, old life gone, and they are raised up out of that water the same way Christ was raised from the tomb, into a new life that cannot be turned back into the old one, not sprinkled with a new identity, plunged into one, dyed all the way through, like that cloth in the vat, until the old color cannot be found anymore. You know that feeling. Maybe you've had it yourself, or watched someone you love go through it. Of coming out of surgery you weren't sure you'd survive. The strange, disoriented relief of hearing someone say, "It's over, you made it." And underneath that relief, something stranger still, the sense that you didn't earn this second chance. You're just breathing it in, one unearned breath at a time, in a life you didn't buy back yourself. That is what baptism has been pointing to this entire time. Not a Sunday morning formality, a death and a rescue, and a second life you didn't earn, carried out in water every single time someone goes under and comes back up. So here's what all of it means for you. Takeaway 1. Baptism was never invented by a church committee or a Sunday tradition. It's a pattern God started writing in Genesis, long before anyone stood in a river in the New Testament. Flood, sea, river, Jordan, all telling the same story from different angles. Takeaway 2. If you have been baptized, that moment was not a formality you checked off a list. It was a burial and a resurrection, carried out in water, over your one and only life. You were plunged, not sprinkled, dyed all the way through, not touched up at the edges. And takeaway 3, the one that matters most to you right now. Every person in this video, from Noah to Naaman to a jailer who almost took his own life, had one thing in common. They didn't rescue themselves. The water did what they could not do for themselves. And that is still true for you, right now, however far from God you feel in this moment. Which of these stories hit you the hardest? Noah, Naaman, Jesus at the Jordan, or the jailer at midnight? Tell me below. I read every single one. You didn't wander onto this video by accident today. Maybe it's time to stop treating your own baptism, past or future, like a formality, and start seeing it for what it has always been. a death, and a second life you didn't earn, breathed into you by someone who plunged under the water first, so you would never have to go under it alone.